University of British Columbia. She'll talk some about her research today, but it generally, some might say, wouldn't have a positive spin, something like exclusion, yet she'll be able to put a little sort of positive spin for us in this group. It's forced her to kind of think about what would it be like studying some of these topics through a positive lens. And she promised me that studying these topics did not come from any exclusion that she experienced or any ostracizing of anyone else. Is that right?
Yeah. Great. Thanks. I'm really excited to be here. I've always wanted to be invited. I finally got to come. But but as I'll explain in a moment, my work tends to be on the opposite end of positive. I tend to I really do self-identify as someone who studies dark things. So it's sort of a challenge, and it's intriguing for me to have a chance to present some of my most current work here. I put this together strictly just for you, but it was a fun exercise. I quite enjoyed it. My first reaction was, I really can't do anything positive with this, and then I revisited because I really wanted to come and meet you all, and I've never been here before, and I thought it'd be really fun and really developmental for me. So I went through all my little data sets. I've got a bunch of them, and I pieced together. It's a little bit of a stretch in some places, but I tried real hard to find, that's why I called it threads of silver lining. So hopefully you can bear with me. And it's great for me because you're a different audience coming from a more positive perspective, which would be really useful to me. And this work that I'm presenting is really new, and so I'd be very interested in your feedback and ideas and questions, because that really helps to shape this work that I'm doing. And it's really, again, I haven't published any of this yet. It's all pretty new, so it's really fun for me and a great opportunity. So I want to thank you for giving it to me. So just to start us off, just a little bit of background, so you know a little bit about me. As I said, I tend to do dark stuff. I don't mean to, it just evolved that way. So I started off looking at psychological contracts, mutual obligations between people at work, but my focus quickly became on broken trust and broken contracts, and that probably started this direction I ended up going in. I've done quite a bit of work in the area of workplace deviance, the violation of organizational norms that causes harm to the organization. I've studied workplace aggression, including employees going postal. More recently, I've looked at territorial behavior and a special emphasis on infringement. And most recently, my work is looking at ostracism. So as you can see, there's a negative theme to this focus, but I thought it would be kind of fun to see what I can do in terms of looking at this newest topic, ostracism and social exclusion, through a more positive perspective. So what does ostracism look like at work? And you'll see for now I'm using the term ostracism and social exclusion somewhat interchangeably. But here's just some example items from an established scale that those of us working in this area are starting to use. Some examples. Others at work shut you out of the conversation. Others leave the area when you enter. Non-voluntarily sitting alone in a crowded lunchroom at work. Others at work do not invite you or ask you if you want anything when they go out for a coffee break. Others at work treat you as if you aren't there. I hope you're not starting to feel paranoid. Like, hey, I've had that happen before. I never thought of it before. But nonetheless, it gives you a bit of an idea of the kinds of behaviors that I'm interested in exploring. So why do I study this, or why have I started to study this? It's hard sometimes to articulate why you like what you like. You know, I don't know, really, but trying to explain a bit of it is, well, I do know that it's pretty common, and it seems to be a common phenomenon in organizations, and that's shown with existing studies that have been done. And also you start to talk to people, people have stories. And no question in my mind, this area of interest emerged partly from, I happened to be reading a book by Kip Williams on ostracism around the same time my mother-in-law in Pennsylvania was emailing me every day talking about how horrible her workplace was. And she didn't have friends there, and these two women were always basically ignoring her. She didn't say she was ostracized, but nonetheless she would be talking to me, and I was a connection for her, and I would write back to her. And we had names for these women who I never met. They weren't very nice, right? Nicknames. And, you know, she'd say, oh, and now they did that. I go, oh, they don't even know you, da-da. You know, and I try to make her feel better. So that happened to be happening at the same time as one day my daughter comes home from school. She goes to an all-girls school, which is a great I don't know what you call it, arena for studying social behavior, let's put it that way. And she happened to mention, we saw an ad for a commercial, a public service announcement about bullying. And she says, oh, Mom, it's not like that at all. That's not how it is. Like, like there was a stereotype, bully on the playground. Because at her school, they didn't bully. They were very good at not bullying. In fact, they were trained from a very early age never to even tell someone you can't play with them. And, well, what did they do? Well, they just ignored you. So you'd have kids hanging out together with sort of like a groupie ring of kids that weren't part of the group but were never really excluded, but nonetheless didn't get to belong. So they squelched one kind of behavior and maybe created another kind. So these things kind of converged, and I got interested in this topic. And while a whole variety of different types of social mistreatment have been studied in organizations for quite a while, ostracism and social exclusion are relatively new topics within organizational behavior to be studied in the workplace, specifically as its own kind of phenomenon. And I kind of like looking in new areas. My argument, and I'll maybe show you some data, is that ostracism may actually have a greater impact on people. And I'm really interested in impact, as I think most of us are. Does it make a difference? And I really think that it does. And then finally, there's something about the fact that there could be something that's powerful, but at the same time so insidious and invisible. It's really the absence of behavior. And I think that intrigues me with this specific phenomenon, unlike perhaps some other things that I've looked at. So that just gives you a little bit of an idea of where I'm coming from. But as I said, I've got silver threads, or we call it threads of silver lining, some positive pieces. And what I want to talk about now are, they're somewhat isolated. So I came up with 4 threads. And so I want to share with you each one of these in separate pieces. And they don't necessarily fit together into a solid story, but you'll see how I sort of grabbing a thread and grabbing a thread and grabbing a thread, trying to look at the positive side of each. Why is it not working? Oh, OK. So the first thread within this realm is that, and I did see this early on, this wasn't just for this talk, I really did notice, this stood out to me, is that ostracism may not be as dark, as negative, as bad as it appears, at least to us researchers. And in a nutshell, sorry, I did this light dark thing a little bit and then I abandoned it. But so most of those looking at social exclusion and ostracism tend to assume that there's some sort of hostile intent involved, that it's a particularly bad behavior, and that the targets or recipients of this behavior would perceive it as negatively, as researchers do. However, as I'll show you in a few minutes, the attributions that targets of ostracism make are not always very negative. In fact, they can be positive. To go into a little bit more detail here, when ostracism is looked at by researchers, there's sort of 2 general categories. One is what they call social exclusion. And this can be more like episodic rejection events. So you want to join a group and they don't choose you. Anyone really bad at sports and of an era when kids got to choose their own teams? You're the last one, that might be a form of rejection. Can I sit at your lunch table? No, that would be a form of rejection. And then there's also those looking at ostracism more broadly. So it can be a variety of different behaviors that make you as a person feel as though you're not part of the group, that you're excluded in some fashion, that in a variety of different ways you're being left out. And here, although it's recognized that there might be a variety of reasons why you might feel that way, much of the focus is on the silent treatment. And we know that that is used as a form of managing people and interacting with them for a variety of reasons. However, if we look at ostracism from those that experience it, we might see things somewhat differently. That they may interpret these same behaviors in a more positive light for a variety of reasons. So I have some data that actually looks at this distinction. I did a content analysis of stories of ostracism and why they occurred among a sample of working adults. I used a sample from using Zoomerang, and you can purchase existing respondents, people who have already agreed to be involved in a survey. And from a larger study, there was a subset of that sample for whom they said, yes, they had been socially excluded or ignored in the last 6 months. And I used those 242 individuals. And so basically, here's what they were asked. The first question, which decided if I would include them in the sample, were, in the past 6 months, have you ever felt socially excluded at work? Have others left you out, ignored you, or given you the silent treatment? Then, if you have ever felt excluded, what would you say is the main cause for being excluded? And people could just write out their answer. Then what we did was we took all of those answers, myself and 2 graduate students, and we tried to group them into categories, a content analysis, to try and see, okay, are there some common categories that emerge, explanations, attributions for why one is being excluded at work. And the researchers might say, well, you're being given the silent treatment. People are trying to punish you. They're trying to exclude you for a variety of reasons about yourself. But as you'll see in a moment, there are actually a wide variety of reasons why people come to think that they're excluded, some that aren't quite so bad. The most common category were differences between oneself and others. Now, keep in mind, this is what people think is the reason they're being excluded or ignored. Of course, the real reason might be something else. But nonetheless, we're interested in actual targets' perceptions. And so we have differences between myself and other, and then we subcategorize those as well: different age, ethnicity, gender, interest, points of view, and other that didn't fit into a broader category. And just to give you some example of some of these differences. Being gay, not into the hunting, fishing, I don't have input into the social events and conversations my coworkers may be engaging in. 95% Hispanic illegals I work with, and they don't like the whites. I like this last one. It made me laugh because it makes me feel so old. I think that people in my department think I'm too old. Most of them are in the early 20s, and I'm 29. You have to be 29 to feel that way about people who are 25. So these are just some examples of people saying, okay, I am being left out, but here's why. Now, of course, they didn't provide more information because it was just an open-ended type of survey. But nonetheless, you can see how they're trying to make sense of why they're being excluded, which may or may not be a bad thing. Okay, I'm 29. Okay, that's not quite so. They're not giving me the silent treatment. They don't have hostile intentions. I'm just different. And so, of course, it's understandable that 23-year-olds don't want to talk to a 29-year-old. Yes?
It's interesting to see that the list here is things about the person. Were there any examples of things that the person did?
Well, a little bit. Yeah, that's a good question. So,
because one of the functions of social ostracism is to get somebody to conform.
Yes.
Group, but to exclude them for something they did that was a violation,
yeah.
To then bring them back in.
Yeah, I agree. So absolutely a way to regulate social norms, right? So if you deviate in a way we don't like, then we can leave you out. Yeah, it's definitely can be used in that way. Whether they recognize, you'll see a little bit of some of that, but not necessarily, right? So to me, it's intriguing because if we could talk to the ostracizers, we might get a very different answer. We don't care that he's 29. The point is he's whatever, or he does da-da-da. We don't trust him. He's a jerk. Who knows what their attribution is? It would be quite different. Well, let's look and see if we have a few. Here's some attributes of the context. So 24% identified things that were just about the situation that they're in. One is the nature of my job, location, shift. So an example, I work in the basement away from everyone else, so they have to make extra effort to involve me and don't normally. Relatively benign explanation, not negative. I mean, it's not great, but it's certainly not negative the way researchers tend to conceptualize ostracism. I'm in a position of authority, right? You're lonely at the top. Because I'm the manager and they feel like I give them a hard time at work for what they do on their personal time. Or outsider status. Because of being new to the position myself, I had to prove myself in order to be part of the clique. So a variety of things. It's not me. It's a situation. It's the role I'm in. It's where I'm located. It's my tenure in the organization. Others' attitudes towards me. Now, this gets a little bit closer to recognizing there's something that they did. Either they dislike me. I felt the reason was 3 employees did not like me. Whenever I'd walk in the room, they would shut up, but just as soon as I left, they would start talking again. I think my mother-in-law may have written that. It was almost like word for word her experience. Or jealousy. Competition and jealousy over promotions I have received. And that was kind of interesting. Is that really the reason? Or is it something else? Right? But nonetheless, people can come up with explanations that are not necessarily about something damning about themselves or something that's necessarily looked like, you know, people trying to punish them or hostile intent. Here's attributes of the self. I thought this was intriguing. I'm a little bit shy and I don't go out of my way to strike up a conversation. So, you know, again, it's kind of like I have control over this. It wouldn't be so bad if only I were reaching out to people more, they wouldn't leave me out. Or attributions of others. These people have bad attitudes and they're holier-than-thou complexes. So this is something wrong with them, not me. Then two other categories that were hard to really group and make meaning of. Either you're with the crowd or you're not, and I'm not with the crowd, or I don't know why. The first is somewhat tautological, right? It's a little bit, well, I'm ostracized because I'm ostracized. But nonetheless, we see a whole variety of different ways by which they make sense of ostracism, which suggests it may not necessarily be viewed as silent treatment. It may not be necessarily viewed as there's something wrong with me. It may not be viewed as they're punishing me for something bad that I've done. Instead, there's a wide range of explanations that may play a role. And while the real reason and the perceived reason might be quite different, I think it's interesting. And I think it's positive that people have a way of viewing what could be potentially detrimental experience and putting a positive spin on it. It's a self-protective mechanism. And it's not really a surprise, because we know people can interpret their environments and do often in ways that protect their ego. It may be a downside because they're not getting feedback that they might otherwise incorporate to change their behavior if that was required. On the other hand, it may help them to sustain a positive mood, feel okay going to work every day, not become depressed because they feel there's something wrong with them. So to me, this is one of the positives. And as I'll demonstrate in my next thread, these positive attributes may also be very useful for buffering employees against the negative effects of ostracism. So most researchers focus on the downsides of social exclusion and ostracism. And research demonstrates that it can cause physical symptoms, absenteeism, depression. Lots of research showing that even, the inkling of being left out or not belonging can be very detrimental to our psyche. So much work has demonstrated that negative effect. On the positive side, I think it's worthwhile to look at, well, is there something that can reduce that impact? What is it about employees that might help to inoculate them against some of this negativity that goes with being left out or excluded? I absolutely believe that these experiences are relatively frequent, especially in organizations, because they're relatively socially sanctioned, they're kind of invisible, and we may be difficult to manage those behaviors. Maybe where we might have more control is helping employees to cope with those events when they happen. So here I did a scenario-based study, which is where you give people, in this case another sample, two different brief stories that they were asked to read, which I'll show you in a moment. And then they were asked to imagine they're experiencing these events, if this was happening to them at work, and how they would react. So here's the scenario. You've been working at a major transportation company. You've really enjoyed the nature of the work you do and the compensation you receive. In recent times, you have felt as though your coworkers may be ignoring or excluding you. You sense this based on a lot of little things, such as they seem to have left you out of social events. Great. Sorry, my phone was on. They seem to have left you out of social events. They've given you the cold shoulder in meetings, and they stop talking when you enter the room. So everybody's given this scenario to read. And then the subsequent part of the scenario is they're given an internal attribution or an external attribution for why this has happened. In the internal one, it reads like this. You believe they're treating you this way because of something about you personally. That is, they're ignoring or excluding you because of something inside of you, such as your personality, who you are, or something that reflects some aspect of you, such as how you look or act. Or they're asked to read, they're asked to imagine that it's an external attribution. You believe they're treating you this way because of something that is not about you personally, but something outside of you. That is, they're ignoring or excluding you because of something that reflects on them, such as their attitude, or reflects something about the situation, such as the location of your office or the hours you work. Now, I was interested in looking at whether these different attributions would play a different role in how it would impact people. Now, of course, it's a scenario, so they're just imagining, and it's not, I haven't actually created real ostracism experiences. But here are the preliminary results. These are the outcome variables. And these are just based upon standardized scales surveys that they completed. Here is the internal attribution, and here is the external attribution. And for at least, so we got 5 of the 7, we see that there's a different result. Specifically, if you take them together, when they're told that they're socially excluded or ostracized, and it's something about them, it has a stronger negative impact on them than when they're excluded and they're led to believe it's something about the situation or the person or people who are excluding them.
They're supposed to imagine themselves in this situation and imagine how they'd be performing?
Yeah, they imagine how they think this would impact them. Now, again, it's limited because it's a scenario. And we may only, I'm a big critic of scenarios, but it was kind of fun to do. But it could just be they're giving you their implicit theory of how they think it would impact them. But if you see it as some potential clue, then I think there's some validity here, right? So say, okay, so imagine you've had this experience, and imagine this is why. How would this impact you? Right? So they fill out, what would your performance be like? Exactly. To what extent would you, likely to quit? How would you feel? Specific behaviors. What behaviors do you think you'd engage in regarding your coworkers? So it's hypothetical. It's not real, and it's also intention-based, right? It's like, what would you do? And we know certainly what we think we would do can often be different than what we would actually do. So it's not strong. It certainly wouldn't stand alone as its own study, but nonetheless, I think it gives a little bit of an idea of what role these attributions might play. To me, it's intuitive that it should make a difference. That if we can find external reasons for why we're being excluded, it doesn't impact us nearly as much. It doesn't threaten our ego as much. It doesn't create the desire perhaps to withdraw quite as much. We don't feel like we don't belong quite as much. So in those ways, I think it could be useful. So that's probably one of my most positive threads, I warn you. So, yes.
Okay. I've gone along with you, and I've agreed with what you've said so far, but how do we know that these people are really telling what they really feel or just rationalizing to themselves because they want to make themselves feel better, but they actually are very hurt and interested?
Yeah. It could be the case. It could be, and several things. You're absolutely right. It could be that they're just out of touch with their own feelings, right? They're feeling devastated. It's actually impacting them. They're not even able to fully make that conscious to themselves, let alone, even if they do make it conscious, are they able to tell us, and are they willing to? Or do they want to be, wouldn't bother me too much, right? We have this bravado. We might have a reason to rationalize. So there's always this layer, I think, of error. With any of this, I do mostly survey research. I might do a scenario-based study, or I might do a survey where people have had this experience in the workplace. I have some data to show you on this too. But again, it's a great question, because there's always that issue of, can we get in people's heads, right? Is that really what's going on? And my colleagues who do experiments, I think, probably get a little bit closer to the phenomenon in that way. Right, because they may create these real, it's still a lab, but nonetheless, right, where they're manipulating how much someone's excluded, and then they're actually measuring real performance, for example. So it gets a little bit closer. Of course, it suffers from its own other challenges that a real-life study does in terms of, if we were doing like a diary in an organization or people keeping track in real time with real relationships, that has advantages. But yeah, it's a problem. I guess the best way I hope for is, if I do enough of these studies, and other people do, and we start to see the exact same pattern, and if that pattern can't just be explained by, implicit theories in people's heads, then I think we get a little bit closer to the phenomenon. But it is limited. Yeah. Other questions or comments? Yes, thanks.
I'm sorry. One more time on this slide. Are the left-hand items reactions, responses? This is what I would like to do.
This is what they would tell us. This is how they tell us they would be impacted by if they were in that scenario. So it's not what they've really done. It's all hypothetical.
So I would, my performance would deteriorate. I would leave. I would do something that's deviant or toward coworkers. Okay.
Yeah, with, of course, each one having more details in them. Yeah. Yes, thanks.
I'd be interested in the level of narcissism in individuals
an interesting variable to look at. It's nice and dark for me. You know?
Because those who may be more narcissistic may have, may react to this a lot differently than those who are not narcissistic. And they'll notice it, they'll feel it, they'll say, some might say, well, they should know I get upset about not being attentive.
Oh, yeah.
And they still do it, so it's about me.
This is, yeah.
Might be the kinds of narcissists who would say, what's wrong with these people?
Yeah, yeah. That's a very good point. And there's data I'm just in the process of collecting now, a large nursing sample. It's really kind of, I think it'll be cool data if we get the response we want. And within there, I won't go into too much details about the study, but one variable that we're looking at is, we didn't really have a label for it. I'm trying to remember what we call it, but it's almost like this sense of entitlement to social attention. Right? So it's this kind of thing. And if you're one of those people who's used to being the center of the universe and having attention, and we try to measure that at the outset, and then you experience any kind of social rejection, does it impact you more strongly? Because it's out of sync with your expectations and what you're used to. And so I think it absolutely fits with what you're talking about. We hadn't thought about narcissism, but it totally, I bet they're highly correlated, if we were to capture it. Yeah.
It would be interesting to look at different types of personality.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, it's a really good idea.
Is most of the assumption here that the groups or the coworkers that are being compared or so forth have a continuum where they have worked together before, so there's a noticeable shift, or?
No, only what you read, unfortunately. So it raises more error because everyone can bring to their own situation. What is their own? They'll impose their own assumptions on that. So yeah, so all they have is, if we go back, is this: you've been working here, you've really enjoyed the nature of the work and the compensation you receive in recent times. So it's as much as you can imagine one might put into that scenario beyond that. So it adds error. So it can reduce effect showing up, right? Because each person in each type of scenario can add all sorts of stuff, really kind of like noise. But hopefully what we see, if there's a difference, that should just be the different attributes, as opposed to these other imagined things, which are going to vary a lot in each group. That makes sense. Okay, so now, number 3. Oh, sorry, no, it's okay. No, it's good, thank you.
So here, what I'm trying to do is make sense of the relative size of the numbers. For example, it looks like, and you can just help, it looks like that if I feel like I am the cause, an internal attribution, I'm more likely to leave, quit, that is.
Yeah. Or you think you're more likely, we want to be more precise, you're more likely to think you're going to leave,
And my performance is going to be affected. But the temporary things like physical withdrawal, deviance from coworkers, negative affect, sense of belonging, I mean, those temporary kinds of things are much less, the magnitude of the numbers is just simply lower. What's interesting to me is
I see what you're saying.
Something permanent is going to happen if I feel like I'm not so good, but I may not. It's not as large an effect if it's if I'm talking about emotions or a sense of belonging, those kinds of things.
I see what you're saying. I'm trying to mentally, even though it's my data, I just made this, I have to block out the 2 that aren't significant. So physical withdrawal, negative affect, sense of belonging. So it's intentions to quit and OCB that have the biggest reported response, right? The behaviors.
And that's a contrast between internal attribution versus external.
Right. Oh, the difference being greatest.
I feel like, well, I don't know. I'm trying to make sense of it, but maybe it's not worth making sense of it.
No, I see. No, I see what you're saying, though. If we're looking at the differences, like it's comparing these differences, like some things are impacted more strongly than others, at least in people's minds.
What does OCB stand for?
Oh, sorry, citizenship behavior. So these are all those, like, what we call good citizenship behavior, so the good, helpful behaviors we do towards coworkers. So you might mentor coworkers, you might help someone with a task, you might read something someone's given you, those sorts of good citizenship kind of things. But these specifically used a scale directed just at coworkers, because you can also have citizenship directed at the organization, and you can be a good citizen in more general terms. Yes?
So I found it really interesting that OCB is higher when you attribute externally.
Let's see, external. So, well, I guess the argument is it drops down when it's internal. That's sort of how I was trying to picture it. I know I did the same thing, right? So it's like, oh, I'm a good citizen no matter what. Oh, but if it's an internal attribution, well, I'm going to cut back on my helpfulness towards coworkers.
Yeah, but the description of them and the external one really wouldn't motivate you to do well by them. I think that's what you said.
Oh, I see what you, yeah. Oh, I see, right, because if you're blaming it on them, which is one of the external, that's a good point. Yeah, I see what you're saying, yeah. Yeah. But sorry, yes. Good. It was a good point. But thanks for helping me to understand it even more. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Oh, yeah.
So in every case, the internal attribution creates more of a response or supported response.
Yes, more of a response that we would probably consider negative, right? Because it's either withdrawing, again, how you spin it, withdrawing positive behavior or more likely engaging in or feeling negative behavior. Again, it's not, I wouldn't put too much weight into it because it is a scenario. It's not, I'm not I guess I mentioned, I'm not a huge fan of scenarios, but I thought it was a good kind of preliminary study to put into this survey because it's not difficult to gather the data. And if it is the case that these attributions matter in the real world, then definitely we should see this effect in these scenarios. But of course, the reverse may not be true. It could be the case that people can hypothetically imagine that they would react that way when, in fact, they don't.
So have you ever looked at or thought about this with respect to the leader? This is all kind of coworker based. And I'm wondering about the status of these kinds of variables with respect to low LMX, which is leader.
Right. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So somebody came up with the insight that leaders don't manage groups, they manage individuals, and they develop really good relationships with some people and not so good with others. That's called LMX, leader-member exchange.
That's it, yeah.
Low LMX, I would think, you might experience as exclusionary.
That's a really good point. I have never, ever thought of looking at the LMX literature. Well, I have before, but I mean not with this lens of if I'm interested in ostracism, is it in there? That's a really good point because absolutely you have this in-group, out-group. And it could also, I mean, I've been conceptualizing this as how coworkers are treating you as opposed to a supervisor. I haven't even gone there yet, which is an element in and of itself. In this nursing study that we're collecting data on, we're doing a variety of measures, but a more precise measure of treatment by people in the organization, the whole unit. And it would include both supervisors and coworkers. And we're hoping to get a more fine-grained analysis. Because right now, well, not in this study, but another one I'll show you, it's kind of a very broad survey, right? To what extent has this happened to you? And this will be more like a network, egocentric network approach, where each person literally we have the names of everybody, which will be converted to numbers, but we'll be able to see to what extent does each person treat you a certain way. And then we'll be able to see, well, maybe it matters who does it. Is it your supervisor? Is it a coworker? Is it how many? Or does it just take one really ostracizing person? Or is it one person with a lot of status? So we could try to look at it more with a more fine-grained analysis that I don't think we've done yet in the literature. Are we doing time? Okay, I'll move to number 3. Okay. All right, now this one isn't positive, but I really wanted to share it with you anyway. It's slightly positive. I tried to write it so it sounds positive. But more positive forms of social sanctions are not positive. See, that's why it's not positive, but it's about positive stuff. Okay, so I think we culturally want to avoid things like, corporal punishment, yelling, harassment, especially in the workplace, our families or schools. Yet we condone things like timeouts, not giving attention to bad behavior, and possibly, like at my daughter's school, well, we don't have bullying, we just ignore you. And I think we may see more and more of this, especially in environments where we clamp down on other ways to respond to negative behavior or to rein in social behavior. So you're not allowed to yell at people. You're not allowed to directly confront them. Maybe you don't want to, you're not even supposed to have direct conflict. So instead, you do something that's passive-aggressive, and it's the silent treatment. And I think we tend to see this more passive approaches, perhaps more enlightened, more professional, certainly less likely to get you in trouble. But I think it, as I will show you with some data, I think it might actually be worse than more direct aggressive behavior. First of all, I did this perception survey. This is using a study response sample. It's a little bit like Zoomerang. It's really, anyone use study response? It's really quite neat. It's at a Syracuse University. And you can, very professionally done, and they will sell you subjects. And you decide how much to pay them. And we paid, if you want to use study response, you can go to their website, just do a Google search on study response. I found paying them $10 a survey gets you an instant response, and maybe that was too much because I got 100 subjects immediately. Like it was almost like too strong of an inducement. You know, like I could have used the money to get a bigger sample or something. But anyway, take that as a tip. But nonetheless, they're very, very good. So I was able to get survey respondents. So our survey here. And it was 100. And we had them evaluate 4 ostracism behavior and 4 aggression behaviors. Randomly chose items from an existing, the Ferris ostracism scale, and 4 items from Glom's aggression scale. I'm forgetting the exact name of it. So you have 4 items. So some is, being ignored, excluded, and some is, harassment, verbal abuse, and stronger behaviors. And we asked people to rank them in terms of how socially unacceptable they were, whether they were psychologically harmful or not, and the extent to which they're prohibited in one's work organization. And again, this is just people's general judgments of what they think. And not surprisingly, it matched what our intuition would probably tell us, which is that ostracism is seen as more socially acceptable than our aggression behaviors at work, not surprising. Aggression is seen as more psychologically harmful than is ostracism. And again, not surprising, aggression is more organizationally prohibited than is the silent treatment. And again, that would match anyone's probably work experience that, there's not really rules against ignoring someone as there might be rules against verbal harassment, for example. So this is just a quick study to see if, not just our lay perceptions, but in general, this is how people view the difference between social exclusion or ostracism and aggression. But my argument is, and really this is a key piece of what I think is one of the more important parts of this stream of research I'm doing, is that ostracism may be more harmful than is more overt, obvious aggression. And there's a variety of different arguments that could be made for this. When you're ostracized, you're invisible. You're not worthy of someone's attention. You're not even worth energy expending upon. At least when you're being aggressed upon, you've evoked attention. You have a social role to play. There's a dynamic involved. You're important enough that you got someone's emotion, that they took action to respond to you, that you exist. And I think there is something psychologically very painful for us to feel like we don't belong, that we're disconnected from humans. And some of the earlier work by Kip Williams, I think, articulated this very well. So it's not my idea, but essentially this notion that, we can't even survive if we're not connected to people. We're social beings. We live, I say your book, Tribe. We live in a tribe, right? And really, if we're cut off from other humans, we die. At some deep level, I think we're conscious of the fact that we can't survive without other people. And so any kind of cues that we might not be fitting in is very threatening to us. And it can be far worse to be left out and excluded psychologically than is someone yelling at you. So, better if I suppose you could argue it's better if your parents are verbally abusive than if they act like you're not there. Sounds horrible, but, I think there might be some truth to that. And the same may be true for, in the workplace. At least if people are picking on you, they notice you, and you may have not a nice role, but maybe you have the scapegoat role. And also, it also gives you a chance to respond, right? if someone reacts to you, you can say something. You can respond. You can fix it. You can ask questions. When people ignore you, they can deny that they're ignoring you. And it can be very subtle. And you don't really know, did it really happen? And you're not sure why it's happening. And so you're ruminating a lot more about it. And so I think for that reason as well, I think it can have a stronger impact. So I was really interested in whether or not this was true or not. Is it the case that it's less psychologically harmful as people tend to think, as my perception study shows, or is it actually worse? So I did the Zoomerang survey of over 1,000 employees, and they completed a self-report survey, and it included ostracism. It included negative acts questionnaire, a whole set of terrible behaviors that people can experience at work, all sorts of different types of social mistreatment. Also, we included a variety of, again, self-report scales. This is more in real time. It's not hypothetical, but it's, what's your performance? To what extent do you engage in these citizenship behaviors and so forth, right? So it's like, what do you really do? How do you really feel? And I'm sorry if this is too small. I just realized it might not look big enough. What this result shows is that if we compare we ran regressions where for each outcome variable, such as one's self-esteem, so we have a self-esteem measure, we could look at whether ostracism predicted self-esteem, or whether aggression predicted self-esteem, or whether both played a role in one's feelings of self-esteem. Likewise, we could look at positive affect. How are you feeling? What is your current state? And to what extent are you ostracized? To what extent have you had these other social mistreatment behaviors? And so essentially, we're looking over a variety of different outcomes, as self-reported by employees, to see whether aggression or ostracism has a bigger impact on those behaviors. And what's reported in each of these are numbers that are within these equations. And a bigger number indicates that it has a stronger correlation or relationship to each of the outcomes. And if you look at, for each of these, we can look at which one's larger. So if we look at self-esteem, it's more strongly related or predicted by experiences of ostracism, because a negative 0.2, than is its relationship with aggression, which is a negative 0.14. Likewise, we see it's predicted by positive affect plays a role, aggression doesn't. For belonging, much more strongly explained by ostracism than is aggression. Two types of commitment. Again, we see that it's more strongly predicted by ostracism. Not so with withdrawal or performance, which I think is interesting because these are behaviors, which I don't know if why there is this potential pattern. But the take-home point, if you look at this together, is that it appears, at least in this data set, that employees are more impacted by this experience of being ignored or excluded in terms of how they feel and their attitudes. It's more explained by that than it is by being aggressed upon and being mistreated in other ways. Yes?
See, I would hypothesize that one of the reasons that ostracism is more devastating is the individual is powerless because there's no acknowledgement that this is happening. Whereas if somebody's aggressive, the institution might get upset with them. But there's no acknowledgement that it's happened.
Yes.
So then I can fall into the word helplessness and feel hopeless, and then depression sets in.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think it's very powerful, because it's insidious and nobody acknowledges that it's happening.
It's in your head. Yeah.
You cannot be empowered and be effective because...
Yeah. I absolutely think you may be right. I don't know what the mechanism is, but this could be easily the explanation. Absolutely. Yes.
Lauren Keishley, who's an expert on bullying in the workplace from the university, she's spoken with you a couple times, kind of, as I understand it, lumps together, even if you don't say hello to the person, don't acknowledge that person's humanity, or if you have a frown on your face when you look at that person, that is bullying. But as you said, can you prove that?
Yeah, and that's why I think it's actually going to be more common because people can deny that it's going on. So I'm angry at you for whatever you do, or maybe you don't dress right, or you're different, or I think you're the reason why I didn't get promoted. Who knows what it is? But I'm angry with you, and now what do? Well, I'll just ignore you. You're invisible. You're dead to me. I could do that, and if you were to call me on it or someone else, what are you talking about? I didn't look at her in the eye. You know what I mean? It's very invisible. And that's why I think it's actually more prevalent, because it's very hard to regulate and control and prevent. What's that? Yeah, it really is. I mean, and it's very subtle. I mean, you start to look at like, oh, I don't know if for those of you who have ever come up for tenure, I chair our tenure and promotion committee, and my husband is coming up for tenure, so I'm really sensitive to this time period. And what I know to be true is that when you're these critical moments, you're really tuned into cues. Right? So if someone doesn't look at you going down the hall, you think, oh, they've been talking about me, right? So it's easier for people to even imagine these things even when they're not the case, like depending upon critical times or events happen or do they know. So behavior is ambiguous, and so we can also see ostracism when it's not there as well as we can deny that it's happened. Yeah, and I'm sorry I missed your...
Research about instances of ostracism in organizations that intentionally encourage diversity, so those that have a strength-based management.
Yeah.
My hypothesis would be that it would decrease if it became like the norm that people are going to be different.
Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting question. It could go both ways, I suppose. Right, here's me being negative again. Positive spin on it. It could be, okay, it's a little bit like, outlawing bullying or outlawing homogeneity. Come on, let's be diverse, let's hang out with people who are different than ourselves, and instead maybe we have these subtle ways of ignoring people who are different. I don't know, people get into pockets. It's interesting, though. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, it might vary for individuals who have internal versus external locus of control, extroversion versus introversion. The ones who may be more extroverted may be more attuned to the cues and more dependent upon them for their own identity, whereas those who are not as extroverted, more introverted, may ignore the people who are ignoring them.
That's a good, yeah, right, and they're oblivious, or, yeah. Well, that's true. Maybe, I mean, again, it could be like the more socially intelligent you are, the more you might notice it too. There's something to be socially unintelligent. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, what she said was a segue into what I was thinking. It's like the respondents, if you had an idea how they responded, but you understood how forewarned they were about how people are wired, just like dealing with type theory, I'm thinking of the thinker versus the feeler.
Yeah.
Thinkers ignore everybody. So it's like, if you don't understand that, you get in a
bunch of academics.
You think.
Yeah.
So it would be interesting to know how forearmed people are in just the fundamentals, and you call it social intelligence, but, fundamentals of type theory and things like this, and to see how that would skew their results.
Yeah.
Because sometimes people, if you understand it enough, you kind of blow it off unless it becomes really apparent.
Sure, and you're absolutely right. So when people report their ostracism, that's their interpretation. The actual base rate might be quite different because in some, it depends on the environment. Like if we have a talk at UBC and we don't have great attendance, we might warn people. It's not you, it's us. Everybody's away. You know what I mean? Like, okay, you read it differently than if someone, your colleague just got back from UBC and, oh, wow, the room was packed. And you didn't have that experience, right? So we interpret things differently through the lens of our personality and also, what are the expectations? What are the norms? And what ostracism looks like in one environment might be quite different than another as well, right? It could be very subtle in some places, where, like a bunch of nerdy academics that don't do eye contact or something. What would that look like to ostracize in that environment? It might be very different than, in a department where everybody's more gregarious and socially out there. Yeah.
I'm interested in cases where there's been an attempt by a company or a workplace environment to foster more connectivity and more of a culture of inclusion, and not just just talking about like diversity training.
Sure, but inclusion in general.
Trying to foster, people getting to know each other, or having lunches together, or more of that kind of activity. And to what extent are they successful or not?
That's a great question, and it's a great useful question, because you think it's almost like how to overcome ostracism.
Right.
I mean, it's at the extreme end. Yeah, this is at the extreme end, but here's like normal to great, here's like dysfunctional to normal, but it seems like the same policies would fit. I don't think it's relative. I think ostracism and social exclusion, at least the slice of it, isn't very studied yet in OB, and so we haven't started to address the organization part of it. So there's stuff in social psychology on ostracism and exclusion, but not with the context, this applied context. What can managers do? Because to me, that's always been an important question. Even though I look at the dark side, I'm really interested in, well, so what do you do? What are the moderators that help people cope or that help to reduce its occurrence? I think, yeah, it's an interesting question. And I don't know the literature on creating inclusiveness. And yeah, that's a great idea, though. Yes?
I think you're making some assumptions about the culture of the organization as well. The issue of narcissism it raises the issue for me.
Yeah.
Maybe, let's say in some sports organizations, that's the way things are done. I mean, it's very obvious. It may be that if you were looking at religious organizations, you have a completely different set of how it's expressed. Or if you're looking at a modern, kind of competitive business, or looking at nonprofits. So these would each probably, because they have different internal cultures, would look at this issue probably quite differently.
Well, certainly, I think in all those places you could have ostracism, but it would manifest differently, right? And what we don't, the plus is I'm taking it from the employee's perspective. So regardless of the context, this is their interpretation, which to me has always been, my work is always focused on the person's experience. That's the valid reality. So in a way, it addresses that. But you're absolutely right. If we're using standardized scales, for example, of ostracism, you read those behaviors. Well, again, those behaviors in some contexts are they don't represent ostracism at all. They represent the way people do business because they're busy, or a variety of other explanations. You're absolutely right. And we don't have our current measures aren't context neutral as they could be, I guess, right? Where it's kind of like a void of specifics. That would be useful. Other questions or comments? Okay. I didn't know I flipped it already. Okay, so my last thread is very positive, and it's this notion that social support may help to buffer against the experience of ostracism. If we look from the perspective of belongingness theory, which is this idea that we all need to belong, it's central to our well-being and our functioning that we feel a connection to other people. And the research suggests we don't have to belong to a lot of people. We have to have some important people in our lives, in the important spheres of our lives, where we have meaningful relationships with others. And this theory would suggest that we have this fundamental need to belong, but that need can be met in different ways. So in other words, if we're not having our belongingness needs met at work as a result of being ostracized by some or many coworkers, we may be able to reduce the impact through our sense of belonging outside of work to family and friends. And I like the idea of looking for solutions that are outside the workplace as well, right? So one can substitute for the other. So I was interested in looking at whether social support from family and friends would moderate the impact of ostracism. In other words, if you've got support from your family and friends, the same level of ostracism won't impact you as much as someone who doesn't have the same sense of support from family and friends. And in a way, maybe it comes from my interaction with my mother-in-law. I didn't really think of myself as social support at the time, but clearly I was serving a role. She's feeling terrible at work. The women she works with in this particular department ignore her. They literally stop talking to her when she comes in. She emails me, I'm 4,000 miles away, but hey, it's still somebody. I'm still connected. I still matter to someone. Who cares about these coworkers? I'm going to retire in a few years anyway. I've got somebody who thinks I'm pretty cool, right? So this would be the idea that if you have that social support, it's going to make you not feel quite so bad, not have the same impact. So in a nutshell, it would look like this in the model. So we have ostracism, we have a variety of outcomes, and we have support of family and friends. And does that support reduce its impact? And what we see here is I tried to simplify it to show you the results. But essentially, if social support moderates the impact, then it should be the case that when you have friends and family support, the relationship between ostracism and outcome should be weaker or non-existent. Follow? Whereas when you don't have that support, the relationship will be strong, as we already saw. So you're ostracized, these bad things happen to you. You got family and friends, you're ostracized, so what? It doesn't really matter. So that's what we're trying to show here, and I've got correlations demonstrating each. Over here, if we were to artificially divide this sample up into two different groups, people that have low support of family and friends and people that have high support of family and friends, we see different relationships between ostracism and outcomes. And essentially what we see, though, is the opposite of what I was predicting. And I swear I wasn't trying to do this. It's not because I study negative things. I really wanted this to be positive, and it's not working. But what we see is that the relationship between ostracism and these outcomes is stronger when you have the support of family and friends, rather than weaker. So in other words, I'm talking to my mother-in-law. She's now feeling worse about being ostracized, not better.
But she's performing better.
She might be. She might be, right? I don't. So I want a couple of hands. I'd love to know. Well, tell me what you're thinking, but I also want to know your possible explanations, if you have some. Yes,
well,
thanks.
My explanation is the people that I'm talking to.
Mm-hmm.
To my sense of moral outrage.
Yeah, I agree. I think you might,
We do try to help, and sometimes we do the opposite. And so, therefore, this is what I would call toxic support rather than...
Yeah, I'm not much help. I agree. We're not therapists. Well, some of us aren't, right? So we're not like, yeah. I mean, we as in family and friends.
It allows them to think more about getting out of there, being less committed to this place that seems kind of bad. Maybe it's actually empowering for them to make a move.
Well, some of the time then, let's say if I was doing the coaching, I might reframe that behavior. And maybe one would be able to break through the ostracism and engage somebody in a conversation. When you, in fact, align with somebody and demonize the person who's acting in a boorish way, not denying that, you're not doing them a favor. The culture a favor either, because then we're just getting into this black and white and not seeing the humanity in others. Can I just say it's not the best strategy?
I absolutely, I totally agree with you. And in fact, so much so that I really feel bad that I was talking to my mother-in-law about this. But seriously, I honestly don't mind, it actually doesn't bother me to think that I'm probably not good at this, but rather I think we do this. I think a lot of us ruminate with friends and family, and I don't think it necessarily makes things better. And I mean that when I say we're not therapists. I assume therapy, you can process and you can pull out and you come up with solutions, right? You don't just wallow, which is mostly we support. Someone tells me their side of the story, I tend to be the person who agrees with them. I see their perspective, I reinforce their perspective, and we spend a lot more time in that thinking about it and how horrible it is and the moral outrage and everything else.
You want to reinforce a sense of victimization.
Yeah, which I think...
Mobilize them to take a positive action, because they see themselves as a victim. By definition, if I'm stuck there, I'm getting out of there, because who wants to be a victim? And so if you can get them to buy into a different story, then they could stay there and be okay. They could provide their own buffer, because they come up with some rationale around those people's behavior, which allows them to continue to be okay.
Yeah.
They don't have the power to define the person's worth.
Okay. Do you have other... Well, it doesn't matter. I think you had your hand up next, so I wanted to see if you had something. Oh, sorry, the guy back there.
I do. I was just thinking more about the contrast effect. At home for a family,
have support from my family, and then
Yeah.
think about the fact that every time I go back to Hong Kong for vacation, I'm very happy, right?
Yeah.
And then the last few days usually very terrible.
Yeah.
And I think about, oh God, I have to go back and get my manuscript rejected.
You don't like us, Czech food.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah. So yeah, you've got this great personal life, and you come to work.
My family, and
Yeah.
and then I realized, oh, I got to go to work. Let's say work, which is so there's the contrast.
Yeah. Yeah.
My family is terrible anyway.
I'm used to it. Yeah. Yeah.
And you might not. Actually, if you compare the comparison between the support that you get at work versus at home, a family.
Yeah.
You see whether the difference actually make a difference.
Yeah.
Might be potentially interesting. Might be one.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, that's another possible theory, I think, that could explain it. Sorry, I'm not going to get the hands in the right order anymore. Who's next? Next, numbers? Blindside.
Back to the theory that you're using to describe this, I'm wondering if the theory intended to, I guess, suggest that there's some kind of balance and that we wouldn't try to find belonging everywhere. So, like, in this explanation, you're saying there's some equilibrium belonging level, and we kind of navigate towards that. When I'm kind of thinking of thriving as opposed to just surviving. So we probably have an inclination to thrive, and we want to belong.
Seeking more no matter what. It's not like, I've got enough that doesn't really bother me. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good possibility, too. Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely understand what you're saying, which would suggest it should always bother you, regardless of what your current level is.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point. Others? Yes?
I am a clinical psychologist.
So you could tell me, what am I doing right now?
And I'm fascinated by this because I hear a lot of my clients come in because of work-related issues. Someone doesn't say hello when you come in and things like that and what that means about them. And what I also see when they're with their friends and they talk about it, yeah, they'll feel worse about work, but then they're stuck because there's nowhere else to go. So when they come into a clinician's office, it's sort of like the last resort. And he says, I can't deal with all this that's going on. And when I share with them, well, you know, maybe your coworkers aren't evil. Maybe they're not. Maybe they're just people. And when I educate them about how people could be, then there's this realization that if they continue on working with me, they'll be changing significantly in such a way that they may not fit in with their friends anymore. And then what then is available to them? So there is the challenge also in working with clients to see, hey, let's try some things. Why don't you have a conversation? Why don't you say hello first? Why don't you do those kinds of things? And it's sort of like it messes with their construct of what the workers, the other workers or the supervisors and the people are. And how are they going to have that communication with their friends? They go back, they tell their friends, and they say, well, that doctor doesn't know what she's talking about.
Right, start all over.
Not only the client's own construct, the construct
With the co-work, because it reinforces itself. Like it's this, the schema that you can't break out of. Oh, yeah. So this makes sense to you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. See, from my point of view, it doesn't. Yeah, because what do I know about this, right? But think, we talk about the social support. It's so good, right? But there's this flips. Support, but not actual. Yeah. It just reinforces you, and so it feels good in the short run, but it probably doesn't do anything. You know, it's good to commiserate, right? Misery likes company, and someone can relate to you, but they're not going beyond empathy. They're just.
There's a reason why they're friends. Alike.
Yeah. Well, I always think that is funny when, if you ever had a disagreement with someone and say, yeah, but everyone I've told agrees with me. Well, duh. You know, they heard your version or whatever. You know. So, any other comments? Yes, thanks.
Just from a simplistic point of view, I totally agree with you. And I think that it could be, when you're looking at it from the angle that you're looking at, self-empowerment for that person if they've got someone that can coach them through it. And that's how we create change, is by doing exactly that and create change in those other people.
Yeah, but coming to see me means you're crazy. Then there won't be change. Unless you have to admit, I must be crazy to come to see. I mean, it's their own construct. I must be crazy to come to the psychologist. They get to realize they're not crazy, and then they say, "Oh, well, why didn't I come sooner?"
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, you've had your hand up for a while. And then Sue.
Measured support in this context, though, because the first thought I had when you talk about support, I thought like, oh, maybe this person, they have like a bad experience at work, but they have a positive experience in like another group setting, for example, like in a sports team.
Right.
And how would this be different, like having positive group experience elsewhere, different from like talking about
well,
with a friend?
That's a good point. And we don't ever get it. I'll tell you the measure, sort of, but we don't ever get at specifically what's going on. We're trying to guess here why there's a relationship, right? We're kind of inventing a lot. We really don't know why there's a correlation, but one theory is how we talk to each other. But so it's a general social support scale that includes items like, when I have a problem, I have friends and family I can turn to. My friends and family provide a lot of emotional support when I need it. That's sort of kind of generic and open, not so much necessarily positive, but rather they're there for me, and I have those people. So does that help a little bit? Of course, what really happens, do they even tell them about this? I don't know. We're kind of assuming a lot of things in there. Yes?
This is a more general question. Have you done anything about looking at the impact of things like email on increasing isolation and exacerbating ostracism and so forth? Because we're doing so much more communication in that mode.
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't looked at it at all. I do know people do, looking at, what's the research on internet use and depression, right? And this idea that people are isolating themselves more and more. I think there's something about that. I know in our group, people aren't physically around very much. They email a lot, and it's very, very different. It changes the dynamic completely. Email is only good for things like, is it 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock that the seminar is? It's not good for any deep, meaningful relationship stuff, I think, at least among work colleagues. So I think the sense of loneliness, I think, is probably increased with email. Whether it creates ostracism, I'm not sure, but you certainly could see that with email. I know someone someone else who won't answer their email. So they do email ostracism. And it's pretty visible. Like they answer everybody else's email but that person's, and it's purposeful, and that person's kind of known to be that who ostracizes in person. So I think the medium can be also used that way. But I don't know anyone who actually studies it like that. I know Kip Williams did some stuff looking at isolation in chat rooms. Some of the early chat rooms. Funny to see the transcript because, so I think people pick it up there, so it's present. Yes. Sorry.
And a slightly different tact. Have you looked at what if you will, the social environment of each individual when they come to the workplace? So, for example, if a person lives alone, they don't have much social context outside of what is available at the workplace, they may have more expectations about how they relate to people. Whereas someone who has, let's say, a full family and there's a lot of social activity outside of work, so when they come to work, they don't even have much of the expectation of a lot of interaction with people. So it'd be interesting to look at it from that standpoint. And then somewhat related is what is the expectation of a given individual regarding interaction and the amount of interaction and the type of interaction when they come to work. With some individuals, they may prefer to not interact with people.
True.
To come, do their work, and maybe interact as necessary for a given project, but outside of that, maybe not have a lot of interaction.
That's a great other category of moderators that I'd like to look at, I think, which is, what role does the workplace play for you? I'm not sure exactly how to measure that, but it may be central to your life or not central. It may be a place where you do seek out or expect social connection at a very humanistic level, not just, hey, what time is the meeting? So it can mean different things for different people. I think that can make a real significant difference. And there's definitely people for whom it's just a place I go, I get my, I put food on the table with that, I'm so busy at my desk, I don't have time, or it isn't psychologically valuable or meaningful to them, whereas for others it is. And you'd think it would make a difference. Or even just noticing ostracism in one context or another, you think it might be quite different.
And then the other point, too, regarding the management that you spoke of earlier is, let's say a manager says to any given individual, you're accountable just to me. You don't have to worry about what others may think of you or say about you or whatever. As long as you do your job and you're accountable to me, don't worry about anything else. So let's say a particular manager has that type of an attitude which he or she then expresses to each of the individuals, then they may allow an individual who prefers not to have a lot of interaction more freedom than to be very accountable to the work at hand and not worry so much about what occurs in the social milieu of an environment.
Possibly, although I would contend that people care for psychological reasons, not instrumental or practical ones. That this, even if the boss says you're not going to lose your job, I mean, take an example, I have tenure. I can't be fired, at least as far as I know, but I know it would still, it might have a direct impact on my work, but I'd feel, if I was experiencing these kinds of things, I think it would be very psychologically hurtful, even if it doesn't have a practical relevance to my work. I think, and I'm a sample of one. But I have a feeling for many people it's more about the need to be connected. And I think, I think that can vary about how much people care about their coworkers, as you're pointing out in your first point. I'm not sure a third party saying don't worry about your job would be, I don't know if that's really the key, that it's a practical issue so much as a psychological one and just wanting to be connected to other people. Yeah, Kim?
This is very troublesome, actually, to me, because the implication is, okay, if you're being ostracized, if you're being ignored, become an isolate, ignore your family, stay away, reduce social support, create suicide.
Well, I don't know if it has to be quite that bad, but yeah, okay.
Indicate the extent to which suicide probabilities go up when you're disconnected, when you don't have social support.
Makes sense, yeah.
Things. So, I mean, that's an extreme case, but the implication of this is reduce social support when things are going bad. I just don't.
Yeah, maybe. Well, let me go to my next slide, which is almost my last slide. I think is because there's more to it. So I think there's more other explanations that we haven't touched on that might make you feel better, I think. But I'm actually now doing, with the nurses study, one of the main the main point of it was to tease this apart more in that study.
I still think it's a more positive story here.
Yeah.
That by having social support, you feel less bad.
Mm-hmm.
You maybe keep your focus on performance, and you start to think about getting out of there to make it better for you. I don't think it has to be.
It doesn't have to be all, but that's true. If we look at the overall pattern, that's a very good point. Let me
reduce your commitment to this place that's so unhealthy. Think of it as a job, but think about finding a different place.
Yeah, but okay, how about in this economy or in this state even? Those options are very limited, sometimes not existent.
Okay, so that's a good point.
Is ostracism always a bad thing? I mean, is it a signaling device for someone who's not?
No, I think it.
There seems to be an assumption here that ostracism is bad. In society, you live with certain levels of ostracism for mutable characteristics of race or gender, or usually for discriminating based on religion. That's wrong.
Yeah.
Ostracism is really more a behavioral relationship thing between parties.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, as the benevolent manager, what are the policy prescriptions for how to treat effects? Because I don't think the law is going to involve, because it's not legal unless it is just a surrogate, it's a pretext for some other prohibited discrimination. It seems to me that this is ultimate implications. What do you want to do if you want to make people perform better?
Well, certainly, I mean, absolutely, I think ostracism serves a social function. So from a functionalist perspective, people use it because it can help to rein in behavior. And because we care so much about belonging, some research would suggest we conform because we want to belong, right? And conformity is not all bad. We need people to follow in a particular direction sometimes. Some people might have very hurtful, harmful behavior that needs to be reined in some fashion. And I was thinking about this even, I was thinking of parenting. I'm a parent, and I had never really had to worry about behavior regulation as an easy kid, but to do timeouts. Was timeout necessary? Well, it's better than spanking, but then if you don't spank, you don't do timeout, what do you do? And it's like, well, of course, there's a variety of things you can do. So I think it's the same in the organization. I don't think you have to I think probably, to me, the healthiest thing would be directly confronting someone and working through the resolution. Yeah.
And so then it's really, is it coming from peers?
Yeah. But I think as with a lot of things in organizations, leaders can seek to foster a culture that makes certain behaviors okay and acceptable. Modeling that behavior, encouraging that behavior, having a culture that says it's okay to point out things that you want to be different. Let's be more direct. Let's be more open. We certainly see ethnic cultures may vary on that dimension more so than others. We certainly probably see that in corporate cultures, that some places it's more okay than others. So I think, how we create culture, of course, is a whole big challenge, but nonetheless, I think that might be the direction to go. So we're neither ostracizing nor engaging in these other hurtful behaviors. So while you might get this positive, it's also, I think it's psychologically painful, and I'm not sure it has to be necessary. But, yeah.
Just building off Ron's comment, that would be like something that would come across as like a positive angle in the future would be to say, when does ostracism lead to like self-growth or self-development, some type of personal development? Because especially if it's like people aren't wanting to spend time with you and they're not really being that mean about it.
But they don't want to, what does that say about you? Yeah.
There's an opportunity to grow.
I guess it all depends on what people are trying to have, what is supposed to be changed about you, right? It's like, it could be a good thing, growth, it could be a bad thing,
Yeah, I was going to say, oftentimes ostracism isn't explicit, so you don't exactly know what it is that you did wrong, and so you don't have a choice about whether you want to conform or not conform. It's just that, you've messed up and you're being shunned. Somebody else has thought you have, and then that...
and you think through all the possible things you might do that are wrong, that are making you not fit, which I don't think would be useful.
Laura Lakeisha's research that Anna was mentioning is on what strategies people use and when they think they're work or not. And actually talking with friends was a common strategy and was perceived to be helpful. Confronting the individual was a lower common and also not perceived to be helpful.
Yeah, well, many of us don't feel equipped to directly confront, right? And we might see from experience or response as well that just created a conflict. It didn't really do anything, right? Because we don't have the tools to do it and, solve a problem together. And instead we escalate it and make it some kind of personal conflict as opposed to problem solving, maybe.
This whole area of what can you do, to change the culture, to affect things. I was reminded of a program called Challenge Day, which works with teenagers. And often you have in the room a bunch of kids that go to the same high school or junior high or middle school, and you've got like the bullies and the ostracized ones who've been picked on, in the same room, and it's very transformative what happens where there's a lot of openness, not confrontation so much, but sort of this increasing awareness of what does this feel like instead of depersonalizing. And sort of seeing what do they have in common, and often there are really significant changes in the culture.
Oh, that's interesting.
And those lives that happen in that sort of intervention, but they do have somebody else.
But you have someone who,
And it's sort of this huge group activity as well, as opposed to just a therapy session with one person.
Right.
There's a lot of other kinds of support.
Right. That's interesting. And that's one possible solution, too. Just for the sake of time, I want to show you this next slide, which were some of the possible explanations. So, I was sort of proposing a substitution effect, right? So if you're getting your needs met elsewhere, being ostracized at work will be less impactful. You had mentioned the contrast effect. We had mentioned, we may have not called it, but I calling it for the sake of rumination effect, that you're processing dysfunctionally as opposed to resolving it. Two other possibilities that came up for me were, one is sort of a high need for affiliation effect, which kind of goes to a point that you had raised earlier. I can't read your name, Deborah. Something you had said which reminded me of that, which was, perhaps it's the case that those who have a lot of social support, family and friends, they have a high need for affiliation, and possibly they just happen to be the ones who would be more sensitive to ostracism. It's a little bit like a contrast effect, but it's more of a personality-based or individual difference that might be going on, that some people are just more sensitive than other people. I was also trying to think of a reverse causation effect. Let me just flip back. So it could be, so we're saying that this impacts this correlation, but it could be that this correlation drives this. That is, the people who are most impacted actively seek out supportive family and friends, and it becomes very salient to them. which is, that was kind of the hopeful, it could be the other way around, right? Because you got to, this is not a longitudinal study, it's a snapshot in time. And so we don't really know what comes first. We just get the snapshot. And that might be a possibility, in which case it could still be very functional. It's just not showing up here. It's just the people who need the most help are seeking social support. And they're still very much hurt, but it doesn't mean it's not working in other useful ways. So in the study that I've started with the nurses, it's a challenge doing this in a field study, but I'm actually trying to look at both ostracism and social support in a more fine-grained approach. And we're doing it's somewhat longitudinal, not hugely, 2 points in time, but sort of like a cross lag design. And I'm also trying to, either by controlling for things or measuring them at least, I'm trying to see if I can tease out what mechanism or mechanisms might be operating here. And because to me it's important to kind of get a little bit more of a handle. We see this correlation, but why is it that case? So is it the case that the people with social, is it rumination the mediating variable, for example? We can see. If we control for high need for affiliation, does the relationship disappear? And I may be able to get a little bit the cause and effect with this cross-lag design. So I'm playing around a little bit with that. So some hope. Oh, closing. One more slide, just real fast.
It's not like the Academy Award music.
I gotta go. Y'all need to do things. Just to summarize. So basically, ostracism is not necessarily perceived as badly as researchers may view it. There are multiple interpretations. I have some preliminary evidence that suggests that positive attributions or external attributions may help to buffer the effects of ostracism, but it's just preliminary at this point. My research suggests that these more positive social sanctions, such as just ignoring people, may actually be more psychologically harmful than more things that we think would be worse, such as aggression. And then finally, the jury's out on the role of social support, whether it helps, hinders, or does a little bit of each in terms of the experience of ostracism. So those are my 4 threads, trying to connect positive psychology and positive scholarship to this otherwise what could be considered a negative experience in the workplace. Ooh, okay, thank you.
I just want to give a few things.